Good morning and welcome to our UBC Learning Circle, Indigenous Climate Action, how Indigenous-led responses to climate crisis can improve community health and well-being. Today's conversation is presented in partnership with the Center for Excellence in Indigenous Health. We'd like to thank the First Nations Health Authority for generously funding the UBC Learning Circle and allowing us to have these conversations today. Before we formally begin, I'd like to acknowledge with respect and gratitude that I'm joining you from the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. Please feel free to introduce yourself and the nation you're calling in from in the chat box. Today's Learning Circle will be exploring Indigenous climate action, how Indigenous-led responses to climate crisis can improve community health and well-being with Michelle Brass. I'll ask the panelists to introduce themselves in just a few moments. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Sarain Squawkin. I'm the Learning Circle Manager. I'm Seal Okanagan on my mother's side and Hickory, Apache, and Belgian on my father's side. I'll be your moderator for today's discussion, and working behind the scenes is our production coordinator, Cynthia Long, and our Learning Circle assistant, Sakira Lumley. They'll both be in the background and interacting with everyone in the chat. Finally, before we get into today's discussion, I'll provide a gentle heads up that the topics covered may be sensitive or emotionally triggering. So please make sure that you are looking after yourself. And if at any point you feel that you need to talk to a friend, elder, counselor, or family member, don't hesitate to do so. We have some prompts in the chat if you need additional support. Now I'll turn it over to our panelists to introduce themselves.
Wonderful. Hi, good morning. Can you hear me okay? Wonderful. Hi, Sarain. Thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me to be part of this webinar this morning. I'm really honored to be here on behalf of Indigenous Climate Action. My name is Michelle Brass, and I am a Saulteaux woman from Yellow Quill First Nation in Treaty 4 territory in what's called Saskatchewan. And I've been a member of the Steering Committee for Indigenous Climate Action for just a little over 5 years. And I'm very proud to be affiliated with Indigenous Climate Action to support the organization and the work that we do and supporting Indigenous communities in addressing climate change, the impacts of climate change, mitigation strategies, community building. And on a personal level, I do a lot of work in the arena of Indigenous food security and sovereignty, and creating healthier communities, both at the individual level and at our collective community level as well. Perfect. Okay, so I'm just going to get started here now and share a little bit about what we're going to be talking about for the next little while. So I was invited to come here as part of the UBC LC, the Learning Circle, to share on behalf of Indigenous Climate Action how climate change strategies, how addressing the issues behind the climate crisis can help strengthen our health and well-being. And climate change is a very scary, huge issue facing humanity. Really, it requires us to show up in a way collectively that we have never done before on a global scale. Which can be overwhelming for a lot of individuals. And so it really is about bringing it back into our local communities, how we can interact and how we can address this crisis together collectively within our own individual worlds and realms, and feel like we're making a difference that way. So I want to start a little bit by sharing who Indigenous Climate Action is and the work that we do. And I think what we'll start off is you can find us at indigenousclimateaction.com. That's our website, and that will be available for you in the chat. And you can check that out anytime. We are a collective organization. We are made up of a collective where we all gather together and share resources, teachings, supporting one another to support Indigenous communities in determining, implementing Indigenous-led solutions to climate change. And it really comes from the community. It's really grassroots up movement. And before I get into it, I'll just actually share a video that we have on our website. It summarizes it a lot better than I can, much more concisely, and then I can fill in the gaps after that. So we'll start with that video. Cynthia, if you can share that.
We're a dynamic team working to transform environmental and climate justice movements as part of the only Indigenous-led climate justice organization in so-called Canada. Rooted in Indigenous rights, sovereignty, and worldviews, we empower communities through game-changing education and training, collaborations, and actions that shift power. Our world is changing. Climate disaster, political unrest, and racial divides have revealed the root causes of injustice: white supremacy, colonialism, and capitalism. Yet proposed solutions are still rooted in the same systems, perpetuating the same problems. It's time to interrupt and challenge these structures. Our solution is simple. We start with our communities. We are confronting racial injustice by looking to our ancestors for guidance. Grounded in ceremonies, local protocols, and knowledge, we create and support trainings, community-owned renewables, and cross-collaborations that amplify Indigenous rights models. There is international recognition that Indigenous peoples' rights are critical for tackling one of the biggest challenges of humanity, the climate crisis. For us, success is measured by the health of our communities and our territories. Our measures can be found with the transfer of land back under Indigenous control and reestablishing our relationship with the natural world. We hope we can count on your support to ensure a just and equitable future for all.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. So yeah, that's just in a nutshell what Indigenous Climate Action does. And you can find out more at our website, signing up for our newsletter and just keeping up to date on what we're doing and the communities that we're supporting, and reach out to us as well to see how we can support you as well. We are a growing organization. We've added some staff members over the last couple of years, and particularly this year. And it's been really incredible. We've had a staff retreat recently where we came together to get to know one another better, to really connect about our ideas, how we're going to work together, visioning for the future. And it was really exciting because everyone felt like this is such meaningful work, and we could really bring our whole selves to the organization and to the work that we do at the community level, and interacting between different communities and going in there to provide those supports. So often in a presentation, I've often done PowerPoint, I've often done sharing of videos and photos, and I more often will do more of an informal chat, sharing the topic and connecting with the people that are participating. And that's really how this one felt to me today, to really come in. And so I would invite, as I share the work of Indigenous Climate Action and how rising to the challenges that we face collectively can really be a catalyst to improving the health and well-being of our communities. I do invite your questions, your participation. One of the things that is a challenge sometimes in a webinar format, right, is that we can't always see each other, but it is a little bit more robust in that we do have the chat feature and some support here. But often when we would come together as communities or in groups, we would sit together collectively, and often in a circle, as opposed to, up on stage or in front of a podium sharing as the expert, because we are all our own experts in our families, in our communities. And that's really one of the root teachings or values and principles, is that we know our communities best. We know our teachings, our history, what we carry forward through our lineages. That is something that comes from within us, from within our hearts, our spirits, and gathering that knowledge by being out on the land, sitting in circle, humbly asking for guidance, for knowledge, receiving that. And so I'd like to bring in that element into these kinds of discussions as well, because one of the things that I find to be so important when facing the climate crisis is how we address it. The way in which we approach our work is just as important as the results we're going for. It really is important how we show up in community settings, how we show up in relationship to each other. And that's really what I want to focus on for this next hour, is really rooting down to relationship, because the climate crisis is going to require that we show up much differently than we have been as a collective society, and a society that has been imposed upon us as Indigenous nations. So I do want to make that distinction clear, because how we would have shown up had our teachings and way of life and original instructions had stayed intact, our world would look very different than it does today. But because we've been oppressed and dispossessed of our homelands and territories, and had an extractive capitalist society imposed upon us, how we show up to survive in our communities, how we've shown up to survive in this particular society is very different than how we normally would have. And so in order to look at Indigenous-led solutions to climate change, we have to look at how would we have shown up? Who are we as Indigenous peoples? And that's going to be different depending on which region you come from, which territory you are a part of. Every ecosystem is different. Every set of teachings that comes from that land, from that particular place, is different, because it requires a different way of interacting with that particular land, with the spirits, the life forms, our relatives from those different lands will be different depending on where you're coming from. So if you're joining us from the West Coast, from the prairies, from Atlantic, the East Coast of what's now Canada, depending on where you're coming from, the landscape in which you're sitting in right now, the landscape in which you live, is vastly different from other landscapes. And that's going to be really important to think about as we address the climate crisis. So I just wanted to start there. How we show up is just as important as what we do. And so a lot of the work we do at Indigenous Climate Action is rooted in the teachings, the ceremonies, our traditional ways. So one thing I want to remind people of, or introduce the idea, depending on what your background is, you may be Indigenous, you may be non-Indigenous, a lot of these conversations include many different groups of people. But one thing that's important to remember is that as Indigenous societies, we were given original instructions on how to live with the land, how to live on the land, how to live in a way that respected the balance and the needs of the collective. And not just the collective of humans, but the collective of all our relations, all living beings, including the water, including the soil, including the trees, including the four-legged and the winged and the water creatures. Those original instructions understood the value of all life. And I don't mean value like monetary value. So again, it's like shifting the mindset on how we show up. It's just the value of life itself, that we all have a role to play, that we are all responsible to one another, and that we have relationships of reciprocity. And so those original teachings told us how to live a good life for the benefit of all, for the enrichment of all, that it wasn't just about taking for our own individual needs or our collective needs as a human creature, but rather how to live to honor all of those that live in this particular ecosystem or way, place of, the territory or homelands, wherever we are of, whichever place we are of or from. Those original instructions would teach us how to behave or how to conduct ourselves for long-term benefit and for long-term thriving and for growth. And we are at a place now where we are so far removed from that. And even just going back to that's the other thing, is that we can't go back. So the original teachings taught us how to live, and we need to remember those teachings. We need to sit in circle. We need to go to ceremony. We need to understand what those teachings are and what that requires of us, and then figure out a way, how can we live those values? How can we live those principles today, in 5 years from now, in 10 years from now? Because the truth is that our ecosystems are completely obliterated in most places around the world. And so if we're looking just at Turtle Island, for example, and I'm coming from Treaty 4 territory, which is in southern Saskatchewan in the Capel Valley, and the ecosystem in the place that I live, 80% plus has been transformed into farmland, mining operations, other forms of economy that take from the land and that have altered the ecosystem in such a dramatic fashion that the way we lived in the past, we couldn't just revert back to that. But what's important about that what's important about going back to understand is that we can still find a way on how do we integrate these kinds of teachings into how we're showing up within our families, within our communities, and then how that will impact the climate crisis. So I wanted to touch first on original instructions and honoring the ecosystems and honoring how we live with one another. So when we're looking at the climate crisis and the obliteration of many of our ecosystems, which, you know, were lush with grasslands, forest, you know, whatever it was that the ecosystems originally had, often were things like, you know, would be carbon sinks now, would be places that would sequester that carbon that's into the atmosphere. So we could go and talk about like the scientific benefit of that. But essentially, again, it's relationships of reciprocity, because there's always a role in things that would be the output and the input, or that giving and that taking. So when we have things in balance that way, including an economy that honors that natural rhythm of the ecosystems in which we come from, you know, that will provide long-term sustainability, regenerative, I always struggle with that word, but to regenerate, you know, the nutrients and the life forms and what, you know, provides that life force, that is really important to honor. So how do we go forward in the climate crisis and address these situations in a way that will honor how we show up, that honor our teachings, and that will contribute to increased health and wellness? Well, one, I said how we show up, it really matters. So one of the things that's really happened, and please, I want to just interrupt myself, but to remind everybody that as I'm speaking, if you have questions, we can chat about those as I'm talking, but we will also have at least 30 minutes at the end where we can ask questions, share what you'd like, and have a conversation that way. But also, if you're burning to share or ask something, don't be shy to ask that, and just letting Serene know as well too. If there's something that's really relevant to what I'm speaking on in the moment, we can stop to discuss that and unpack it a little bit more. So how we show up in the world and how we address the climate crisis. So one thing that's really happened in climate justice circles is a lot of people getting burnt out, becoming ill, getting tired, because we're in this place where the crisis is so vast and so urgent. It's a crisis. I mean, that is the definition of a crisis. It needs an immediate response, and failure to respond to it would mean devastation or some kind of major negative consequence. And so in order to address that, it requires urgency and a vast changing in how we do things. And so people who go into the climate justice movement, you know, we have a passion for our homelands, we have a passion for our people, a passion for all of our animal and plant relatives and the waters and all that gives us life. And we want to defend it, we want to save it, we want to protect it, you know, and that is so innate, I think, in the human experience. Once you have that relationship with the land, which is part of the problem, is that so many of us are disconnected from our places that provide that life, that we are lacking that relationship. But those who do, or remember and feel that calling in their spirit and go forward to protect what's left of that, do it with such passion and commitment. And it's like a David and Goliath story, right? Like, we're up against so much that many of us get burnt out. It's exhausting. And there are issues even within these circles, you know, with a lot of things that come with having our kinship systems and our teachings obliterated, how we relate to one another. So often lateral violence, or just social breakdown, right? And how do we connect with one another in those ways? And then doing the work, often it's a fight. We're fighting against climate change and the drivers behind climate change, the causes. And now it's fighting to stop them even more because it's too late. So we're just looking to mitigate or make it less bad than it's going to be. And so it's this fighting. And it puts us into a fight or flight response. It puts our nervous systems into an activated state where we're fighting against something big. We are fleeing at times, you know, our homes when we're faced with like a catastrophic weather event and having to flee our homes. and sometimes fawning over governments and corporations just to work with us a little bit. So there's all these trauma responses that we're experiencing in our bodies. It breaks down our energy, and we get burnt out. And so a lot of the discussion within Indigenous Climate Action and other organizations and communities and groups that we are affiliated with and are allies with, we're talking a lot now about healing justice. And we have a healing justice component within Indigenous Climate Action as well, because it's really about healing the land, healing our relationship to the lands that give us prosperity and life, and the global society right now and the extractive economy that is running the world is extremely detrimental. It's destructive, it's exploitative, it's extractive, and it's causing the death of our Mother Earth. It's causing the death of our waterways, our forests, our soils, and our communities. And it's very, very devastating. And so really understanding the life and the health of not only these lands, but of ourselves and our kinship systems, how we live in community. So often people will talk about self-care, which I'm a huge proponent of self-care. I do take care of myself, and I always encourage others to do that. But that's like the bare minimum. We also need to increase it to community care, because when we're living in an exploitative, extractive economy that requires us to work a certain number of hours in order to make a certain amount of income just to buy, our shelter and our food and rising costs, and we're going to see more of our costs rising as a result of climate change and all the impacts it's going to have on our food systems, on supply chain issues, on weather events that are going to wipe out crops, and all of the doom and gloom that is coming as a result of the climate crisis. It's going to be more expensive. And so we have people, part of our kinship systems as Indigenous people, we had this extended family. We had all of our aunties and uncles and cousins and all of our grandmas and, all of our cookums and our mushums and like the community, we all had a role. And there was this, interchange and intersections of how we would live with one another. And we're lacking that right now. The current society that we're living in has imposed the nuclear family where we're very separated from each other. So you have, if you have a 2-parent household or a 2-adult household, or whoever the adults in that household are, if there's 2 or more, but working full time and looking after children, and like you look at the society where we have like seniors in care and children and toddlers in daycare, like we're separate, it's all separated out, and it's packed, like it's compartmentalized, and so it's not working together. And when you look at, and I can only speak to where I'm coming from, so I also want to clarify that. I'm Soto from Treaty 4 territory, and so like we also had differences in our systems, in our governance, in how, because we come from different ecosystems, we come from different climates and spaces that would have required differences. So I am speaking in a very general manner and speaking from the place in which I come from and what I know. So just take that and understanding that that's where I'm coming from, that different places would have some differences there. But we need collective care. And so one thing that I'm saying is that when we start addressing the climate crisis, it's because costs are going up, for example. We might start looking at living again in homes where we have different generations, living intergenerationally again, living with our grandparents, living with, and having that care. But the challenge in that, it sounds like great, let's like get community care and start like supporting one another again. But because of the result of colonization, which is the cause of climate change, when you go back and look at the history of colonization and the purpose of going out and colonizing the lands and accessing resource to extract from the lands, to create this economy, to create these countries, Canada and the United States, and what we have now. And then those are the drivers of climate change when we look at greenhouse gas emissions and the global food system and all those things. So for us to go back to try to live together in Indigenous communities, we are dealing with the fallout of colonization every single day. And so we'll say things like, yes, community care, but we start coming together. There are so many unresolved health issues, mental health, spiritual health, like emotional health, all of those things. So I'm talking about how we can start to create health and well-being in our communities through the climate crisis, but I'm not saying it's easy. We have to vision this and see, like, how can we make it so that we can thrive again, and mitigate this and be in it together. So living together, for example, if we were to look at mitigating the costs of the climate crisis within our own personal family and looking at the rising energy costs, food costs. I know we're all seeing it right now. We're all experiencing that in our homes. And then we start looking at how can we live together. That does provide that sense of community that we used to have, but coming with that is all of the unresolved trauma that we're living with every day. And then, so it's not always ideal to live together. So that requires us then to do our healing work. It requires us, whether that is through ceremony, through therapy, through collective circle sharing. But I bring this up, and you'll notice I'm going to kind of jump around a little bit, and that's because everything is interconnected. That is a core teaching of Indigenous societies. Everything is interconnected, and the response to the climate crisis means everything is interconnected because nothing is compartmentalized. Society, humans have decided, let's separate this stuff out. We're going to have healthcare here and education here and the economy here and like these different departments, but they all impact one another. And so we come to live together to reduce costs. And then all of a sudden, we haven't dealt with our childhood traumas. We haven't dealt with their substance abuse issues that need to be addressed, or whatever other crisis is going on. And we're facing a lot of this in our communities. And so I often say that all of it is climate action. People say, well, what is climate action? Like, what is Indigenous climate action? Who are we and what do we do? Well, we do many different things. Some people speak on the global stage about Indigenous rights and international rights and go and make sure that our voices are heard in that arena. Other people are fighting extractive resource industries and standing up in their homelands and saying no more. Other people are planting gardens and gathering food and really pushing things forward in the food sovereignty and security movement. Some people are doing solar and wind energy, and how can we have clean energy to power our homes? There's all sorts of things that people are doing. But also what's important is our well-being and our health. Looking after our mental and emotional health, looking after our traumas is also climate action, because when things come down, we're going to have to work together, and we need to work together in a way that creates more health and well-being and not be harmful. So, going to therapy is climate action. Going to ceremony is climate action. Doing your dark inner work is climate action, right? And then that goes back to the community care. Being able to ask for help, being able to ask for support, being in a place where you can give help and support, and making sure to know what are your limits. Making sure that you can provide help in a way that isn't going to completely drain you. But really, I was talking about extractive resources and industries, and how we can look at the climate crisis and addressing it as the health and well-being of those ecosystems, that we are protecting the waters and the soils from deforestation practices, practices that are driving our economy, but that are detrimental to our environments. But that also, I want to point out that climate action is also about doing our individual and collective healing as well, because addressing these is more than just saying no to an extractive industry. It's also about saying yes to something else that we want, right? We can say no to and it's important to do both. And whatever work, wherever you're showing up in your work, it's all important because it's all interconnected. But it's also important to envision, what is it we're trying to build? What is it we're trying to move towards? Because it's also very scary. Climate change, when you really look at it, when you really look at the science, when you really look at the prophecies and the teachings behind the climate crisis, when you really look at what we're facing in 5 years, in 10 years, what we're facing right now with everything that's happening with natural disasters and extreme weather events and communities becoming displaced and food shortages and global sicknesses, it is really, really scary. And so it's also important, one of the things that we've been told through ceremony is being warned to prepare. And it means preparing your home. It doesn't mean like stockpiling and being selfish and hoarding. That is not what preparing means. Preparing means, yes, looking after your family, making sure that we are prepared. As Indigenous communities, we were always preparing for winter. We were always preparing for hard times. We always gathered what we would need in the spring, summer, fall months, and we would make sure that that would see us through. So it's the same idea, making sure we have, but that is also in a collective, not hoarding for your nuclear family, not hoarding just for yourself, but to making sure that you have enough to look after the community. And so it's making sure that we have that, but preparing also means being spiritually strong, making sure that we can look at this and face it instead of burying our heads in the sand or avoiding it and carrying on like nothing is happening. It's also important that we nurture and nourish that part in ourselves as well. Emotionally, looking after yourself as well, because it is very difficult work to face. So making sure, you might have heard of eco-anxiety and this phenomenon, and it's a very real thing. I experience it. I have a 10-year-old son, and I'm very scared. And I do have eco-anxiety, which is why I do the work that I do. And I funnel myself into working on food security and food sovereignty initiatives, because I'm also trained as a health coach, as a wellness coach. So I talk a lot about healthy eating, which factor change conversation, which food systems am I going to support? Global extractive food industries or food systems that we have been with us for ages, and replenishing and reviving those practices. So finding your way to face this crisis in whichever industry you're in. And think of which industry you're in. You might be working for government, you might be working for a tribal council, you might be an educator, you might be an artist. You might think, okay, that's for activists and that's for the people who work in climate change departments to address, but we all have a role to play. So health and wellness coaches and educators and ceremonialists and people who practice and walk that path, we all have a role to play. And I think we also need to start connecting in being able to talk about this more, because again, the health and wellness, I'm talking about mental and emotional health here and spiritual health in this context, how we manage our eco-anxiety, again, how we show up in addressing this crisis is important, is vital, because we're going to need to support and lean on one another. So shifting the conversation from self-care to community care, even though they're both important, self-care is community care, because the more you can look after yourself, the better you can show up for your family and community. But we also need to make sure that we take that next step of community care as well, looking after the children collectively, making sure our old ones are looked after and honored, and making sure, and honored, and I don't mean like putting up, like, because of course we have to talk about lots of health issues. So like making sure we always manage our safety and well-being, but integrating these ways as best we can. So I wanted to address on that. And before I go on, I wondered if there's any questions or thoughts yet before I continue on to kind of my next point.
We have a couple questions if you want to answer them. So can you tell us perhaps what will happen when the Native peoples return to our traditional relationship with marijuana and growing of marijuana? Do you support the new Green Revolution?
Okay, sure, I can take that question. I actually can't answer that question simply because I'm not familiar with where that fits in. So that's I'm ill-equipped to answer that question. I know that it benefits a lot of people, and I know a lot of people find that it addresses a lot of health concerns. And then I know other people that it triggers anxiety, or they've had like too much negative interactions with it maybe over time, and then so it doesn't do well. So again, it's like understanding you as an individual, what's going to work for you. And so everybody will have different things that work for them. And so on a personal level, I might, personal choice, like, if you do, as long as, it's always about, I guess when I look at Indigenous teachings, it's always about that balance between looking after yourself and not creating harm in your collective community, because we have rights and we have responsibilities to one another, right? And so I guess that would be my only thing when it comes to that, is that balance between being able to look after your individual self in the way that best suits you, and then making sure that that doesn't overlap into creating any harm for other people. But that's a really generalized answer. So unfortunately, I don't have the expertise, because it's just not my area I couldn't speak knowledgeably about that. So I'll have to just let that one go. But there would be other people that could go deep into that conversation. So I would invite you to have that conversation. I think it's an important one to have, and that definitely gets explored, because I think we are going to be coming up with that a lot more, or coming into that conversation a lot more.
We just have one other question. It says, would you consider the treaty relationship to be a form of spiritual care and or self-care?
As a form of spiritual care and self-care? Okay, so I'm going to write that one down. Let's revisit that. I have an answer for that, and it's nuanced, but I want to talk about a couple of other things so I can refer to some of it when I answer that question. So let's kind of park that one for a second. Okay, I'm glad that one came up though, because it really is about the relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous, Indigenous nations and governments that we have to interact with, jurisdiction, and community health and well-being. So I definitely have an answer for that one. But one thing I wanted to address really quickly about how we show up in the climate movement and how we address these issues and how it's going to increase our health is also the idea of rest in our communities. So I was just talking about individual care, collective care. So many of us are burnt out in the climate justice movement. And so many of us are just burnt out from living in this society where it's like takes so much to get ahead. We're zoning out in the evenings. Maybe not you, not everybody, but I know when I was working full-time, I'm self-employed now, so I have more flexibility in my work, but when I had to be at a place between certain hours and then race home and make dinner and look at, people are looking after children and running a household and looking after family members, it's so much and it's exhausting. And again, going back to that community care, reestablishing our kinship systems, making sure that we're living a little bit more collectively so that we can share that workload of food preparation, of household management, of making an income, of childcare, of elder care. There's an opportunity to revitalize our kinship systems when we're looking at facing a climate crisis, because we're looking at living more effectively, more efficiently with our energy use, decreasing our energy use, and spreading that around and sharing the resources that we have, because we have dwindling resources and the resources that are there are coming at a cost. And not just a financial cost, but an environmental cost, a spiritual cost. And so it's important that we address that. The other thing I like to talk about is, it seems so urgent. Well, it is urgent. It doesn't seem urgent. There is a deep urgency to address these issues. But it's also important that we rest and we look to the natural cycles of the world. So our society is really backwards. We're not living in accordance with the natural laws that we're surrounded by. So take, for instance, right now, it's September in our hemisphere, well, it's September everywhere, but in our hemisphere, we're going into the winter season and into the fall, and then eventually into the winter season. And so the nights are getting longer, our days are getting shorter, but yet we're all ramping up because we're going back to school, we're starting our extracurricular activities, we're gearing up. We had this kind of, the time of summertime of vacations and going to the lake or the beach or wherever you go for a holiday, or just time off of school. It's this kind of collective rest space. But that's backwards. In Indigenous societies, the summer days are very long, and those are working hours. We get up, there's our ceremonies around the summer solstice, and we're doing them there. But we're also we're gathering foods. We're getting all the berries that are that come into their ripeness or the picking time at certain times, depending if it's Saskatoons or raspberries or choke cherries or strawberries or blueberries, whatever. They all come ripe at different times, and we would gather them, and we're preserving them, whether that's drying them, crushing them, whatever it is we're doing. But we're working, we're gathering our foods, we're gathering the items to live so that we can get through the winter. And as we go into the winter time, the lights are longer, we're resting more, That's when we tell stories. If you look at the teachings of our storytelling, when there's snow on the ground, we're sitting around collectively, intergenerationally, sharing these stories. But in the society that we're living now, the sun is going down sooner and rising later, which affects our circadian rhythm, which affects our natural sleep cycle. So our bodies are more tired because our bodies, we are nature. We are creatures of the world, and we are creatures of our ecosystems, and we are impacted so deeply by the sun and the moon cycles. And that sun cycle dictates our rest periods, but we're going against that, and we're using artificial light, and we have this society where we're like ramping up at a time when our bodies are supposed to be resting. And so when we look at I'm pointing at my light here, which you can't see, but you can see the shadow. But there's a light in this room because it's darker outside than it's a cloudy day here. So I don't have as much bright natural light in this space that I normally would. But we're using artificial light. So that's fuel, that is energy to, the electricity that we're running in our homes. And so when we look at how to conserve, when you look at how we used to live when it was a candlelight, we would be sleeping longer during those nighttime hours and getting the rest. And so how do we incorporate that into our society again? Because we're a society that is, we're overstimulated. We have sleep problems are through the roof. Like people are suffering sleep problems, which impacts productivity, which impacts safety, which impacts all sorts of areas, our ability to learn and retain information, our ability to manage our emotions. Like when you're tired, you probably have less patience than you do when you're well rested. And so all of these things, again, so a lot of the climate crisis is a result of us being so disconnected from the natural rhythms of life. And so when we look at how do we mitigate and how do we adapt, a lot of it is working with our natural systems, and we are of those natural systems. And so rest is vitally important. I always suggest we always have electronics and TV, and I'm guilty of it as well, but shutting things down earlier, sleeping and resting, getting the rest that we need. Because again, so much of us are facing major health issues as a result of not getting the rest we need, not letting our bodies rejuvenate and recharge. And so in the healing justice work and climate justice work, a lot of people are taking extended time off because they have been going for so long, so hard, that our bodies just eventually shut down. We can only push them so far before they shut down. And so then there's this extended rest. How can we integrate that more seamlessly, or again community care, because we would have to support one another. There has to be a collective agreement that we're not calling each other lazy, that we're not looking down on one another, and that's internalized capitalism that we need to unpack within ourselves. But then it's also the reality that we all have to pay our bills, and many of us have to show up for work. So how do we incorporate those changes? So finding ways to rest. And within Indigenous Climate Action, with one of our retreats, I believe in March of 2020 or April of 2020, but it was right after the global lockdown, we had a virtual gathering, as many of us were doing during this time, and talking about how can we continue to work effectively without burning out. And we started to talk about cycles in nature, of understanding spring as a time of growth and new ideas and new beginnings. Summer is a time of working and gathering and getting things prepared. Fall being a place of harvest and seeing the abundance that season, the prior season, had to offer. And then wintertime is a time of rest. But our society is backwards. So how do we do that? So ICA, for example, Indigenous Climate Action, we have a 4-hour work week. Sorry, not a 4-hour, 4-day work week. 4 hours that is a completely different conversation. There's actually a book called that, but I'm talking about a 4-day work week. So Fridays being a day off. For people to tend to their health and wellness, to tend to their families, to tend to their well-being, because the work is so demanding. And so as an organization, we talk about how can we walk our talk and make sure that we're supporting one another to be well rested, to feel connected and supported while doing this important work. So there are more organizations around the world that are starting to implement this idea of a 4-day work week. Some of them are still doing like 10-hour days instead of 8-hour or 7-hour days. And so then it's like the same amount of work, but people are kind of playing with this idea. But I think it's important to start looking at as a society, how can we start to integrate more rest and recharge periods? And I also want to say rest for the sake of rest. Like, we have to accept that we're human and that we are these creatures. Like, none of this like rest so we can be more productive for the capitalist, extractive, exploitist society that we live in. Because then it's transactional. Then that rest becomes something that's like, I have to rest so that I can be more productive in this economy. It's really about rest because rest is sacred. I always tell people rest is sacred. There's a time for rest. There's a time to recharge and rejuvenate. Everything in nature rests. Everything in nature has a rest period or a dormant period of going into this dormant phase. Nothing grows and grows and grows and grows without stopping, except for this extractive capitalist society that will just take and take and take. And the only thing I think that happens like that in nature is like cancer cells. Like, that will just grow and grow and grow and grow and grow without stopping until it consumes its the life that it is within. And so, making sure that we understand that unlimited growth isn't a natural way of being, that we have rhythms and cycles. And so conversely, us as humans, we can't just continue to like push and push and push and output and just rest so that we can have more output. Rest because we are deserving of rest. Taking naps in the afternoon. So some organizations have little nap pods, or having a space that you can go. But many of us would be afraid to do that in our workplaces, because then we're going to be looked at as slacking or lazy or whatever. I know I would, if I was really tired in the afternoon, I mean, maybe I'd go, if my workplace had that, to go rest for 10 or 15 minutes would be really, really great. But if I was the only one doing it repeatedly, even though it was good for my health and I could, interact better with my coworkers afterwards, I would probably feel really self-conscious. So this goes back into that collective care, supporting one another. Because the more well-rested we are, again, all of these things, when we start to tackle climate change, we need to be in a place where we are well nourished, well supported, because it requires so much of us. The climate crisis is a deeply spiritual crisis. It's a crisis of all industries, of all levels, and I don't mean like of all vocations as well, like all ways of it impacts so many areas of our life, and so understanding that rest is resistance. Because of course, like this society of ours, like, and so much of our economy is based on an old model of factories, of factory manufacturing, of putting in your hours, and when it shuts down, there's no productivity happening. But we're in a different era now. We're in a different way, but we're still expecting to show up more and more and faster and electronically all the time. And so rest is a radical act, and it's hard because the climate crisis is so urgent, but yet that rest is so vital as well. So it's likened as well to, like, say, a symphony or a choir. And somebody had shared this analogy. I didn't come up with this myself, but it's like when there's a high, long note, some people can hold the note and then other people can take a breath. And then when that person who's singing needs to take a breath, they can go down and the other can carry it. Or like in a symphony where there's different, the strings, and then the different, the different sections of an orchestra will shine during their time so that the other section can rest. And I think, again, collectively, when we look at climate action, climate justice, healing justice, Indigenous justice, all of these intersections, it's like we can't all go at full speed. We all need to, sometimes we can, like summertime energy, go and get the stuff done. But when it's time to rest in the winter, and I'm speaking metaphorically here, of course, but well, both, but like in this case, metaphorically, when it's your time to rest, somebody else can pick that up. So I think we have conversations on standing up to large resource industry, to imploring our governments to change public policy, to address the climate crisis, right from national and international policy, right down to our local governments. So all of that is really important. But it's also like how we are showing up with one another. All right, so I just want to take a quick pause here. Yeah, rest is a radical act. How beautiful to point it out that way. Thank you, Victoria. I appreciate that. Yeah, I mean, I know I used to rest so that I could be more productive, and I would feel guilty for resting, but then I would alleviate my guilt. Well, if I'm more productive, then it's okay. And there isn't a single animal, I think, or like life form that does that. I could be wrong. I mean, I don't know all of them. Again, it's going back to Indigenous values. So the whole topic of this webinar, of this conversation, is how Indigenous-led responses to the climate crisis can improve our health and well-being. Again, going back to understanding our ecosystems, the place in which we live. What are the original instructions, and how can we apply how to live a good life in the current environment in which we find ourselves under oppressive governments? How do we rise up and make these changes in our communities and in our personal lives? How we do it is just important as what we do. So making sure that we're giving each other that permission, that encouragement. Rest your body. Eat this nourishing food, sharing your resources, getting your internal healing done so that you can live with your family and live in a communal setting without, being in a trauma response all the time and activated. And rest is part of that. Eating really good food, healthy nutrient food, not shelf stable food that is calorie high, but nutrient, that's calorie dense, but doesn't have nutrients. We want nutrient dense food that will nourish our bones and our minds and our brains and our overall well-being, coming together collectively to share food as well. So I'll touch here on the food area because it's my major area of work. So the other way in which Indigenous-led climate responses can improve our health and well-being is looking at how would we engage on the land. So the land provided everything for us. It was our shelter, it was our nourishment. We had extensive food economies. And food was our currency. Food and medicines and plants and the animals that would nourish us through their medicinal properties or through just their nourishment of our bodies to create strong, healthy individuals and communities, that has been removed from us. So you look at the history of what's Canada now in particular, and our food systems were purposefully decimated to make way for the Canadian project. And so you look at the expansion of Europeans of English descent mostly and French, but looking at the English coming here and creating areas for farmland, for mining, for all the resources. You look at books like Clearing the Plains, that was written by James Dashak, that really documents the removal of our buffalo relatives. And these were our relatives, and this was a genocide, and we're still feeling that grief and that the devastation of that. But you look at removing that from the plains to make way for farmland, and the removal of us as humans from our traditional territories into reserves, and then the stealing of our children to be put into residential schools. Throughout that whole history, and of course the whole point of that was to remove us from the land to make way for an economy that would build and support Canada, and you look down in the US and the way they did it down there, to build these incredibly rich nations on a global scale. Our food systems were completely decimated. Our ability to gather our foods and medicines, to hunt small game, large game, and interact in that way had a huge detriment on our health. And this is something we would do collectively. We would go, and we still do it today. When you look at people, when you go hunting, it is a collective act. People will go out quietly, on their own own, but you go and you do that and you process that relative that gave its life for you to nourish your body, you know. So when you're doing the processing out in the field and then packing that back home so you can bring it back, and then the division of the organs and the muscle meats and the bones and all the parts that would nourish us in different ways, that is a community act. I mean, a lot of people are doing it individually now because of just the way, you know, how we got to where we are today. But you look at berry picking, medicine gathering, we do this collectively. So when we're doing these kinds of acts, one, we're getting out on the land and we're developing and nourishing that relationship with the natural world. And that is vital for climate action. We have to love our Mother Earth. We have to love her so fiercely, we will do anything to protect her. And that's what people on the front lines of climate justice are doing because of our vast love for her and our children, and our communities, because it is really, really hard work. So when you go and gather your own foods and medicines, you're on the land, you get to know her, you get to know these plants. They all have a story, they all have a teaching, and they all have something to teach us. It also humbles us because as humans, we have gotten this incredibly huge ego that we like, this idea that we're on the top of the food chain, which is creating the destruction of the lands around us, because we are not at the top. We are in deep relationship of reciprocity. And so we go and we pick these plants or these medicines or take an animal's life. They are giving us to us. We have teachings around how the animals decided to take pity on us and nourish us. And so when we understand those stories, we understand that when they get that there is a relationship of reciprocity, we need to protect them as much as they nourish us. They love us. There's stories about cedar and that grandmother cedar medicine and how much she loves us and wants to bring us comfort. When we know those teachings and those stories, we're more apt to protect those places. But it also nourishes and helps us. It's climate action because we're getting out on the land. And as Indigenous peoples, when we go to our traditional territories and exercise our responsibilities to the land to go and gather these medicines to heal our bodies and our communities, often we're pushing up against policy, public policy, trespassing laws, or is this private land or crown land? These are our traditional territories in which we have every right to be on and that we never, ever, ever forget. Like so I'm going to talk about the treaties. I have not forgotten about your question. I'm going to get to it. So we agreed to share, but we didn't cede. This is why when we do land acknowledgements and we hear about this, they're unceded territories. And there may have been agreements to share. Or there are agreements to share, not may have. There are many agreements to share, but to share, not to like completely give over to governments and corporations to do as they please at the detriment of the collective and of our own future generations. So when you start looking at the food industry and start looking at Indigenous food systems and sovereignty, we go out on the land and we gather, and sometimes we get arrested, or sometimes we get harassed, and sometimes we get killed. And this is something that we need to also face. We need to talk about the relationships between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people and how we interact with our natural food systems, because the climate crisis is going to require us to reevaluate and establish strong relationships in order to mitigate the worst of it. Because Indigenous communities, this is the thing about Indigenous climate action, is that we remind people that Indigenous peoples collectively as a whole globally contribute the least to the climate crisis, to greenhouse gas emissions, to the drivers behind climate change, but we are impacted the most and first. So when you look at who is on the front lines, who's living in the remote areas, who's living in the Arctic, who's living on the trap lines, who's living on the small islands or the coastal regions, who are the people that are living there, they're going to get impacted first, but yet we are the smallest contributors when you look at, you know, who are the owners of the operations and industries that are driving global changes. And then when you look at what can address or mitigate the knowledge, the way of living in right relationships of reciprocity. And so again, I'm going around here and there because again, it's so interconnected. And so again, when we go back to food gathering as an Indigenous practice, as an Indigenous-led response to climate change, because food prices are going up, because global food systems are collapsing, because they are based on this premise of growth without any respite, without, we look at fertilizers, which demand even more and more and more from the soil. And we look at soil erosion and degradation. We need nourishing, robust, healthy soil. And that comes from having an understanding of the whole soil system and grass and grasslands and animals like bison and all, how it all works together to build up healthy soil. And so I do a lot of work on talking about different farming systems or different ways of regenerating soil for grass, for reestablishing these ecosystems that would sequester carbon, that then give like health and well-being to us as people. Because when we go out onto the land, we're moving our bodies, we're getting that physical exercise. When we're gathering berries, we're stretching our arms, we're, bending down low, squatting, we're moving our bodies in natural movements that get us out of our chairs and our desks and our couches and in the car. And we're moving in these natural ways. We are getting our hands dirty in the soil, in the earth, which has microbes, nutrients that benefit us in that relationship of reciprocity. We're talking with the women or the men or whoever we're with in the bush, talking and picking and sharing stories and laughing. And then we go back and we're cleaning up the food and divvying it and sharing meals. And then we're developing that relationship again with the land. And it's going to require more of that because we're seeing crops being decimated worldwide by an industrial system that continues to take and degrade the land and not always give back. Now, there are advances, there are things that are happening in those industries. But again, I always go back to our original teachings. And is it honoring all the different life forms? And sometimes it's really difficult. There is a transition period to look at doing that, because also I'm not considering or suggesting that we all go start hunting and gathering, because so many of our ecosystems are fragile. There's very little of it left when you look at what's been converted to different types of operations. So that wouldn't be realistic as well. We have to also understand the carrying capacity of what's left of our ecosystems and honor that. So we can't all just go do that, but we can do food forests. We can do different types of food collective projects that honor those. And again, it's for our health and well-being. It's eating those foods that are more nourishing to our bodies, really nurturing our spirits, nurturing the relationships we have with one another. And so I'm going to start wrapping it up. I'm going to answer that question and go into questions. But what I wanted to share most in this presentation is that it's about revitalizing relationships. If I can leave you with kind of one concept after sitting through this discussion, is that climate action is all boiled down to relationships. It's the relationship we have within ourselves and healing our traumas. It's the relationship that we have within our families and our communities, the responsibility we have to one another. It's about the responsibility we have to the lands, to the waters, to the soils, to the animals, to making sure that they're protected. Understanding the relationship between energy use, extractive resources, where your food comes from, who's in charge of education, who is benefiting from certain propaganda. Like, it's all interconnected, but understanding what are the relationships, and getting some rest. Get some rest, nourish your body, because also the climate crisis is going to bring hard times. And this is known in a lot of our prophecies, and we're seeing it happen now with a lot of coastal regions experiencing extreme weather events, drought, flooding. That's going to continue, and it's going to require us to stand up and help one another, because we're past the point of like, we've stopped the discussion of stopping climate change. Right now, we're just like, how can we mitigate and adapt? Because we're trying to mitigate the worst impacts and adapt to the changes that are coming. And that's going to require that we are healthy as individuals, that we have healthy communities, and the answers will bring increased health and wellness, because a lot of it is about reverting to natural systems, understanding natural cycles of the seasons. There's a right time to do things, understanding rest and when it's time to work, and when to share and to not hoard and to look after one another. So it's all important. So I always look at taking action to the climate crisis from a health and wellness lens. just because that's my area of passion, and everybody has a fundamentally important role to play. But I'm also very protective of the people that are working in this climate crisis on the front lines, because I see them dropping and burning out, and we have to ramp up our collective care and look after one another. But there's also potential for us to remember our original teachings and instructions, living by Indigenous values. And again, that is about being in relationship to one another, understanding reciprocity, looking after each other, caring for one another. And that's the spiritual crisis behind the climate crisis, is that we became too individualistic and concerned about ourselves as humans and as individuals. And it's really about understanding the role we play there, and really caring deeply and loving so deeply that we will take that action every day. So I'm going to leave it there, but I want to answer the question. So Serene, can you remind me of the question about the treaty question? And then there's a few more here.
Yep. I'm just going to go to it real quick. Would you consider the treaty relationship to be a form of spiritual care and or self-care?
Okay, yeah. So the treaty relationship, yeah. So like, I have a hard time relating to that as necessarily as an individual, because they are these collective agreements, but they do represent us as community members on both sides. So yeah, like we have to stay together. Not stay together. It's gonna be required that we work together, and we look at the treaty relationship. I have such mixed feelings about, okay, I gotta preface this. I have very mixed feelings with the treaty relationship. I'm talking specifically about the numbered treaties, okay? So not necessarily the peace and friendship treaties or the Robinson treaties or other treaties prior that happened further east than where I live, but specifically the numbered treaties that were negotiated in the area that these treaty territories cover. I don't believe that the Canadian government or that the British Crown and the British government at the time actually meant to uphold those agreements. I really believe that they felt that Indigenous peoples were going to die off, that they were making these agreements so that they could take access to the land quickly as the United States government was increasing in power and moving across vast areas of land. And so they needed to sign treaties to very quickly and peacefully settle the land, remove Indigenous peoples from the land in order to bring settlers out. So I don't believe that they had good intentions, because if you look at the dates of the treaties that were signed and you look at the dates of legislation that was passed, specifically if you look at, say, Treaty 4, which is the territory that I'm coming to you from, Treaty 4 was signed in 1874. Treaty 6, which is just north of me, covering what's called Saskatchewan as well, was signed in 1876. The Indian Act was also passed in 1876. So you cannot on one hand negotiate a treaty in good faith saying we're going to provide this in agreement to share the land, and at the same time develop policy and legislation that basically incarcerates us onto reserve, makes our entire way of life illegal, and is really meant to decimate us. If not like our lives, but like as to practice our lives in any meaningful way as Indigenous people. And the Indian Act wasn't just passed in 1876 like that. There was predecessors. So there was the eventual the Enfranchisement Act. I can't remember the names of them all, but they were all the lead ups to the present, to the 1876 Indian Act, and then its present incarceration in its present day form. You know what I mean? So, so I want to preface that with the treaty agreement. However, I believe, it's a spiritual agreement. When you look at the teachings of elders, they consulted in ceremony. What should we do? Should we sign? And we were protected by. And I want to be careful what I get into, because a lot of this is really meant to be shared in a very specific way. So I'm just going to allude very quickly and carefully to that, but that we did consult in ceremony. We were directed to sign for the well-being of our people, and told that our spiritual relatives would look after us in that way, and the consequences of those agreements being violated. It also addresses areas of health, education, economy, all areas that contribute to our health and well-being, which are not being honored when you look at what is being funded on reserve right now versus provincial schools, at least in Saskatchewan, and I would imagine it would be similar in other provincial territories or other provinces and territories. Health outcomes of Indigenous people are vastly lower than our non-Indigenous counterparts. We face all sorts of health issues as a result of colonization, and healthcare is addressed in the treaties. There is a role, I think, when you look back at those agreements to address, individual health as well as collective health and well-being. And I would like more non-Indigenous Canadians to understand those treaties and to demand and call your MPs and MLAs and demand that they be honored and upheld. Because the fact of the matter is Indigenous peoples are on the front lines of the climate crisis. We are the ones that are standing up to corporations, to oil companies, mining companies, to the RCMP, to the Canadian government, to the US government. We are standing there with our literal bodies and lives on the line. Leaving our families and communities. And we have many, many crises happening in our own communities when we look at drinking water issues, healthcare outcomes, education outcomes, poverty, economic crises, mental, spiritual, and emotional health crises when we look at many other areas that we're struggling with. And so, yeah, I would ask non-Indigenous Canadians to make sure that those agreements are upheld, because it is a travesty that we're dealing with this. And if you want to support climate action and Indigenous-led climate action, you have to support our communities and not just the parts that you just agree with. Like, we know our communities, we know our teachings. And so the treaty relationship plays that role because you are treaty signatories. You are the descendants of treaty signatories, just as we are. We are in relationship to each other. And it is a relationship of reciprocity. So again, most Canadians have access to these lands, crown lands, private lands, lands for industry, while Indigenous peoples have these tiny little tracts of land, and we are suffering and struggling to survive and facing this climate crisis and taking action to stand up against it. Well, Canada benefits from these agreements. And so as descendants of people who benefit from farmland, from all of the riches that have come from the resources of the land, from our relatives, because again, from an Indigenous perspective, these are not resources. These are our relatives. These are our entities, life forms that we have a responsibility to live in right relationship with. So understanding the viewpoint and the worldview of the ecosystem in which you're living. If you're living on a farm or living on a city, know the ecosystem, understand that treaty relationship, start to read about it and start to practice it and ask your governments, demand them, write letters, call, whatever you do, and ask that those be upheld. So that's my rant. So yeah, I think there's a role to play with the treaty relationship for sure in addressing that, because you look at something even like Jordan's Principle, for example, right? Which was in response to, I won't go to the story behind Jordan's Principle for time, but the point of having this in place now is to make sure that children, whether they're situated on reserve or not, whether they fall under federal or provincial jurisdiction, will have the same access to health, education, in order, so as an individual right there, making sure that we're looking after each other that way. So yeah, I think there's a role. Thank you for asking that question. I've never been asked that question before, so I really appreciate it.
Our next question is, do you have any suggestions for employees who would like to contribute to decolonizing and improving the climate action of our organizations/companies? Rest and reduced work are both brilliant climate policies, but I'm not sure how to contribute these actions without holding a position of leadership.
Okay. Read that one again. I got most of it, but the second time I can gather the whole question.
Do you have any suggestions for employees who would like to contribute to decolonizing and improving the climate action of our organizations and companies? Rest and reduced work are both brilliant climate policies, but I'm not sure how to contribute to these actions without holding a position of leadership.
Right. So so definitely the rest and reducing work week. Making sure, because it's really unnecessary for the most part that we spend 7.5 to 8 hours a day at work, depending on what your role is. If you are like manning a front desk or security, like there are some roles that hour to hour really is important, absolutely. But there's a lot of other jobs that are kind of in the professional information sector that, you know, we're working on projects and tasks and outcomes in our work plans that don't necessarily always require that much of time. So yeah, the rest in the reducing work. And collectively talking to people a little bit about that, starting any kind of organizing. You know, I mean, there's a reason that unions have been really powerful in negotiating rights on behalf of workers. So I'm not saying unions are perfect, but it's about collective. Again, it's about gathering information and resources on behalf of the collective. And that's actually how we even got weekends. That's how we got reduced hours, is through that. So you might not have the energy. I'm not saying like, well, yeah, maybe I'm saying like, you could look at starting a union in your organization, or a collective of workers that want to bring like health and wellness. And we see more health and wellness again in work. And I'm not just saying like, oh, do yoga and like your lunch hour, because sometimes a lot of this wellness is like window dressing. Like it appears to be about wellness, but it's really just like the bare minimum so that they can continue to extract more out of us as workers. And I'm also not trying to vilify all organizations. I mean, you know, we're all working together for whatever the organization's purpose is. But I would start with gathering with like-minded people, checking in with one another. I know there's this difference with like work life, personal life, so I'm not like wanting to blur lines there. I have to think about that a little bit more. My first ones are kind of rest and reducing work week, because that I feel is a bit more tangible to begin with. I had to leave traditional work in many ways because of the detrimental effects I was having with many different areas. So that would be one I would brainstorm with. So I would gather with other coworkers and people who have like similar thoughts or ideas, even if you don't work in the same industry as them, but just start talking about and envisioning what would feel better. Maybe you start again with the individual self. What is it that you need to thrive? And how is your work or work environment either supporting that or harming that? Where is it helpful and where is it harmful? And some things can be helpful to a point, and then it tips into harmful. So helpful in its compensation package, that you have enough money to live a good life and buy healthy food and, you know, to support your family. But maybe harmful that in order to make enough that you have to work too many hours. So it could be on pay, you know, making sure that we have pay equity, making sure that we're well compensated. What is the minimum wage, or what is the average wage or salary in that? Protecting our rights and responsibilities with like occupational health and safety, that kind of thing, making sure that those are respected. So yeah, I mean, that is how we created change, right? As unions, when we weren't in positions of leadership, but failing that, or if that isn't in place or unrealistic for you at the moment, figuring out what you would need and seeing if there's a way that the employer or that environment could provide that, or at least reduces ours so that you can go get that elsewhere and start that conversation. I hope that's helpful. And then look at it, like, I mean, Indigenous Climate Action, we're doing our best to have an organization that walks this talk, and we have these conversations all the time. How do we make sure our employees, our staff, like are not our employees, we don't even call it, like it's because that's the common vernacular and that's the words that we're using, but we even we're challenging ourselves all the time on the terminology that we use, on how we interact. So at our last, gathering, we talked about, like, as an organization, how do we want to relate to one another to make sure that, one, we are getting the work done, but two, we're doing it in a way that is creating and adding to the health and well-being of us as individuals and as a collective. And there are no easy answers. But we did talk a little bit about rest cycles. So we talked about, like, we can't always be go, 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 go. So for example, when the COP gatherings come up, or when there's another international space to be present at, how can we make sure we're well nourished for that? How can we make sure we're well prepared? to send people or to make sure that we are like represented there in a good way that is not going to be draining or harmful to people. And it's a balance, and a lot of it's trial and error. A lot of it is like we're so ingrained in working in a very particular way that as leaders it can be scary to be like, okay, just and then what do we do if it doesn't work? So we're kind of failing forward sometimes, like we'll try this and sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. There's a lot of pivoting. So some organizations are doing it. And I think we might, try to figure things out so that other organizations can maybe, learn that way. So it's about being that leader in how we work. So a convoluted answer. I'm sorry, I couldn't be more specific, and I was thinking out loud a little bit there, but I hope that was helpful. I'm going to think about that a little bit more and try to give some more concrete examples, because we did find a few things within Indigenous climate action, like when can we have rest cycles, or like some departments might need to ramp up, but the challenge is that the work is so urgent that we all want to do it until we burn out almost, because we're so passionate about it. And so putting those checks and balances, making sure that people take that time to rest.
Our next question is, we have an election coming up. How do you move this further up the political agenda?
Okay, which type of election? Can you clarify a little bit for me? Which, this way?
They didn't clarify. They just said just election.
Okay, all right. I mean, well, it's gonna, for all that, like at all levels of election. So federal, provincial, municipal, and Indigenous community, like all the elections. So repeat the question again for me.
We have an election coming up. How do we move this further up on the political agenda?
Right. Well, and that's the big question. That's like every election for how long?
They just said municipal
election coming in Vancouver, right?
Vancouver.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that. Yeah, this has been the challenge of all of these organizations, is how do we get this on the agenda? How do we get this people talking about this? And so again, collectively, like there's power in numbers. We need more people as candidates are knocking on doors, bringing it up over and over. And again, I always try to bring the connections, because every single industry, every single person is going to be impacted by the climate crisis. It's just a matter of when. And so people that are of higher privilege, that have access to more resources, can insulate from the impacts for a lot longer than others who have fewer resources. And so it's a matter of finding out or thinking of, when is this going to impact me? So the biggest ones right now are global illness, which has impacted everybody when we look at the COVID-19 pandemic. When you look, and we were predicting this as a global crisis quite some time ago. And when we look at the climate crisis, we are looking at more increased global sicknesses. Food shortages worldwide, so rising food costs. When you look at flooding and drought and how that's going to impact our food cycles and production. When you look at disruptions to distribution worldwide, when we look at how we distribute food and other goods. So we had the supply chain issues that were impacted by COVID-19. And again, I'm going back and around, but showing the connections. So when the candidates come, always bringing it back to that. If they're talking about the economy, it's connected to the global crisis, the climate crisis. If we're talking about healthcare, it's connected to the climate crisis. If we're talking about education, it's all connected. And so changing that, because you know what hasn't happened? People aren't really caring about the earth. The ones that are on the land do, and most of the people who are on the land aren't always. I'm generalizing, okay? There are some people that are both, and that are in both worlds and straddle these different arenas and industries, but or spaces. But for the most part, so many people are far removed. So, and it's human nature that we're just going to look at issues that impact ourselves individually or just our own families. So finding ways, and what we found is when we tried to push the environmental, like, hey, it's good for the environment, and even promoting Indigenous values in Indigenous communities with leadership and chiefs and councils and people who are in decision-making positions, when they're dealing with poverty and other crises, sometimes saving the environment doesn't seem like Like they're just like, well, we need money for our community. We have a health crisis. We need more money for education and to like get healthcare and mental health supports in our community. And so we're going to take this money from whatever corporation that's going to, you know, invest. There's a whole strategy behind it. So the Vancouver election is, again, the more people want to get elected. And so what are the people talking about? And if more people in the constituency are bringing this up over and over and over again, and that's a hard question, because that's the biggest challenge we've had, is how do we get this more on the like mainstream agenda? And I think until there's a tipping point of regular people who aren't saying environment or economy that understand, I honestly don't think until people's economy is really vastly impacted by the degradation of the environment, and I'm hoping to be proven wrong, but it hasn't shown it to be the case yet. But I think until we have enough people collectively bringing it up, then it becomes an issue. They'll have to respond. They have no choice but to. But most people are talking about food prices are connected to the climate crisis. So I would start there and start connecting the dots, having somebody who is efficient and skilled at showing how the climate crisis is going to impact you as a nurse or as an educator or as a welder or whatever, you know, whatever role you play. I think that is kind of the next step. I hope that's sort of helpful.
Thank you. And then
that we grapple with all the time.
Yeah.
I have more questions than answers, to be truthful. So, right, we all do.
Definitely. And then, is there a website to find the various agreements so we can become more knowledgeable and offer as much support as settlers as we can?
Okay, is there a sorry, say it again.
Is there a website to various agreements so we can become more knowledgeable and offer more support? Offer as much support as settlers as we can.
Yeah, you know, I would go to the Indigenous Climate Action website. So it's Indigenous-climateaction.com. And I know we can put that into the chat for people. Start there. Just go there. There are tons of resources and information on that website. Our primary role is to support Indigenous communities in forming and implementing Indigenous-led solutions to the climate crisis, because it's going to be different for each community depending on where they're situated in the world and what their particular challenges are going to be and how they address it. As settler descendants or settler society, we need resources. So stand with us at rallies, stand with us, not, you know, don't come and save us. We don't need saving, but we do need support. So understanding, you know, reading up. So there would be resources there. When it comes to different agreements, where are you situated? If you don't mind putting it in the chat. And you don't have to if you don't want to, but sometimes like you can start looking up just like treaty agreements. Like I live in Treaty 4 territory. So what is that agreement? What was promised? You can type in, you know, like treaties of Canada and information will come up, and start reading that. You can start reading the writings of Alexander Morris, who was the commissioner who negotiated the treaties. And there are books that you can read. And then there's another one. It is got a red cover, and it's about the treaties not being negotiated in good faith. Something in surrender. It's not coming to me. I know somebody probably listening maybe knows what I'm talking about, but I can see if I can share that resource after. But there's a lot of, once you start reading a couple of them, you can start to find out. So just Googling that, but definitely start at indigenousclimateaction.com and look at what's happening there. We need support in the forms of bodies showing up to different events. We need financial resources to continue to grow as an organization. So that's a huge one. Promoting the work that we do, you know, some social capital and sharing amongst your networks. But primarily I say to settler society and settler descendant society is to learn, be humble yourselves, ask some questions. And the number one question I would ask you, and people get really, really ask yourself, are you willing to relinquish power? as a white person living in Canada, as a settler descendant, so it doesn't have to be white, and I'm half white. I'm Soto and of British and English ancestry, or British and Swiss ancestry. So this applies to my own family members. Are you willing to relinquish power? So if there's a farm in your family, would you ever give that up? Would you ever give up your privilege? Because what I have come to find with settler society is that you're willing to support and help as far as you can until it gets to the point of relinquishing any power over lands and resources. So this is the thing with Indigenous and non-Indigenous relationship, treaty relationship, coming together to combat the climate crisis when we look at Indigenous rights over lands and territories, international rights. If you look at UNDRIP, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, I would suggest reading that and looking at all the different articles that talk about free, prior, and informed consent, as well as all of the other rights of Indigenous peoples, and ask yourself how you relate to that. What emotions does that bring up? Because a lot of people are willing to support as long as they don't actually have to put skin in the game and relinquish any power. And this is the most difficult conversation to have, and it is the most vital one to have. Because when we look at the front lines, who's on it? Who is the oppressor? Who are the oppressed? And when you stand behind Indigenous peoples, when you look at the international legal agreements and the treaty agreements, Indigenous peoples have the strongest legal leg to stand on to stop any resource development in an area that will perpetuate the impacts of climate change. And so stopping those projects, getting behind Indigenous rights is vital, and also understanding the power dynamics at play and really examining your own role in that. And it is not easy work, and I'm not pretending it is, and it is uncomfortable conversations, and they are dangerous conversations for Indigenous peoples to have with non, because we are under legal oppression and under threat to our lives all the time. So this is a touchy topic, but start with the website. I know I went deep there. Start with that website. But that's what I would suggest. Thank you for your open-mindedness in hearing the answer I had to that question for everybody, because I know that can be uncomfortable, but climate change is uncomfortable. The impacts are uncomfortable. What we're facing is going to be extremely uncomfortable. And so we just need to face all of these conversations and questions head on. And again, it's all about relationships. And Indigenous and non-Indigenous people, we are in a very toxic relationship that really needs a lot of unpacking and examining in order to address this climate crisis, to make sure that we're protecting our relatives in the soil, the water, the lands, all of it that provide life. And so these questions and conversations are really important. Thank you so much for having me today.
Well, yeah, we have one last question. I feel kind of overwhelmed and I'm not sure what I can do to help my community. What are a few tips I can do personally to contribute to climate change, and that is in response to my culture
Sure.
as well?
Okay, well, I can share what I do. Okay, really basic stuff. I drink water every day, and I acknowledge the spirit of this water as much as I can. Not every day, not every sip. I mean, I'm just human and I'm living a busy life. But it's also important to understand, you know, the whole standing, when we stood up at Standing Rock, and the mantra of water is life, you know, it's true. And so really understanding, connecting with water, because water has a spirit. Water will hear you. Talk to your water and pray with your water. It will deepen that spiritual connection, and it is the life force of our Mother Earth. And it's the water that is being impacted so deeply when it comes to climate action. When we look at flooding, droughts, and the like pollution and whatnot to our waterways. Get out and walk every day. Get out in nature someplace if you can. So I have trails that I can go to nearby. I live in the Capel Valley. Even if you're in the city, any kind of place, and go and find trees that you connect with and talk to them. Trees have spirit. They listen. They want to help us. So go have conversations there. That's really important. Try to pick some kind of food, maybe start with some kind of food foraging. So if it's Saskatoon berries or choke cherries or any kind of berries, see what grows in your region and start picking them, or start doing some plant identification. and just start to build those connections that way. The number one way is through food, really. So because it incorporates climate action, cultural connection, health and well-being. And if you're confined to only grocery store shopping, try to buy more whole foods and less packaged foods, and try to buy more local foods. So incorporating more ancestral indigenous foods. So berries as much as you can. Frozen berries have lots of nutrients, more so, the fresh ones that aren't so fresh anymore. But start with whole natural foods, and understanding where your food's coming from. So I try not to buy oranges that come from South Africa. Not that I have anything against the people in the economy of South Africa, but that is a long way for those oranges to be transported, and the carbon footprint is incredible. Even oranges where I live, I mean, they're still being shipped from Florida or California or BC. They're coming a long way. So what is, more berries is what I get here. So trying to eat more foods that come from your ecosystem, because as our ecosystems continue to collapse as a result of climate change, and that's what's happening, our ecosystems are collapsing. I am being alarmist because it is true, and we need to be sounding the alarm and take it very seriously. Start eating and learning how to eat foods that would naturally grow in your region. So squash, for example, where I live, I'm trying to eat more squash because they were an ancestral indigenous food. They last a long time. You can store them. They grow quite well, and they're nourishing, and they're not being transported from far away. And so I'm already trying to adapt in my own household and with my family on the foods that I eat. So trying to eat less foods that come from far away, like bananas, because this is in a tropical region, and bananas are awesome and they're really tasty. But I'm just trying to replace them with things that would be more local and be mindful of the food system. I find that that's the number one way. So yeah, spiritually, drink some water, connect to spirit, get out in nature, connect with the trees, the soil, and then your food. Understand where your food comes from. Eat more ancestral foods that are of your region as much as possible, and start making those tiny little shifts there. And this is my area that I'm most passionate about. So feel free to reach out to me anytime as well. And I have a website, and people can reach out to me, and it's michellebrass.com. And I'm happy to support this type of work on how we can make micro changes within our families that lead to bigger changes for the climate crisis.
And that was our last question.
Wonderful. I know we went over time, but I am so grateful to be here, and I'm glad that there were lots of questions today, and really challenging ones too that really pushed me. So I appreciate that.
Yeah, thank you to Michelle and everyone for joining us today. And thank you so much, Michelle, for the amazing discussion. It was great to learn about the different food systems and how that impacts our carbon footprint, and how we need to analyze and think about the different ways that our environment impacts the climate action. And yeah, we're really happy to have you on the Learning Circle. Just before we end the webinar, we would love to bring your attention to our upcoming learning circles. An uproot approach to decolonizing pharmacy and education. That's on September 27th with Larry and Jason. And then we have 23 and men, me/men, that's with Elijah Buffalo. That's October 4th at 10 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. And then building the fire stewardship program, Insights from the Field. That's on October 12th with William and Russell Myers. Sign up for our newsletter. The link will be in the chat. All the webinars are free to sign up for on our website, www.learningscircle.ubc.ca. And we hope you have a great rest of your day. Thank you. Long lived. Bye-bye.